They say sterling dignity relies on total control, especially of their flawless bodies. But watching from the shadows as my mother-in-law grips the microphone, sweat drenching her twitching face, I know that control is shattering. The mistress's pristine white Valentino gown is about to witness a permanent biological disaster. They threw my clothes in the trash to make room for her. But tonight, I am clearing out their insides literally on live television. My name is Kira Fairchild, and at 32 years old, I am the clinical pharmacist at Vanguard Memorial, one of the most prestigious private hospitals on the East Coast. My days are defined by precision. I deal in micrograms and milliliters, in the delicate balance between therapeutic efficacy and toxicity. 1 decimal point displaced can mean the difference between healing a patient and stopping their heart. I am respected for my mind, for my steady hands, and for my ability to recall the interaction profile of over 5,000 pharmacological compounds without consulting a database. However, within the marble walls of the Sterling estate, my doctorate and my career are treated as nothing more than a convenient domestic utility. To the world, the Sterlings are the picture of organic perfection, the royal family of the wellness industry. Sterling Wellness is an empire built on the promise of eternal youth, selling collagen peptides and holistic cleanses to millions of desperate customers who want to look like my husband and his parents. But I know the truth. I know that the sterling glow does not come from meditation and kale smoothies. It comes from the color-coded plastic sorter I hold in my hand every Sunday night. I stood in the sterile, white-tiled pantry of our Beacon Hill townhouse, the silence of the house pressing against my ears. It was late, past 11 at night, and the only sound was the rhythmic rattle of pills hitting the bottom of plastic compartments. This was my weekly ritual, while my husband, Lance, slept soundly upstairs, and his parents rested in their wing. I was down here, curating their survival, for Preston Sterling, my father-in-law. It was 20 milligrams of lisinopril for his blood pressure, carefully counterbalanced with a potassium-sparing diuretic because he refused to give up his scotch. For Victoria, the matriarch and face of the brand, the regimen was far more complex. She took a cocktail of hormone replacement therapies, aggressive anti-anxiety medications, and a proprietary blend of nootropics to keep her sharp during board meetings. I was the gatekeeper. I held the keys to the high-security cabinet where the real medicine was kept, the heavy-duty pharmaceuticals that kept the Sterling Empire standing upright. If the public knew that the woman preaching about natural immunity was dependent on a synthetic serotonin reuptake inhibitor to get out of bed, the stock price would plummet by morning. I snapped the lid of the Sunday compartment shut. My fingers were dry, the skin around my cuticles cracked from constant hand-washing at the hospital. I looked at my hands, functional and unadorned. I had stopped wearing my diamond engagement ring months ago when I was at home, mostly because Victoria had once commented that it looked too heavy for my slender fingers, a backhanded way of saying my hands were not elegant enough to carry a Sterling heirloom. Lance walked into the kitchen then. My husband was a beautiful man. There was no other word for it. He possessed the kind of symmetry that made people stop and stare, with jawline sharp enough to cut glass and eyes the color of polished slate. He was the heir apparent to the company, the golden prince who was supposed to take the throne at the 40th anniversary gala this weekend. He paused by the refrigerator, the light casting a halo around his dark hair. He did not look at me. He looked through me, focused on the pitcher of filtered water. "Are you almost done with those?" he asked, his voice tight. "I am just finishing your mother's morning stack," I replied, my tone neutral. I kept my eyes on the pill organizer. There was a time when he would have come up behind me, wrapped his arms around my waist, and kissed the nape of my neck, whispering thanks for taking care of his family. Now, he stood 5 feet away, creating a physical boundary that felt like an ocean. "Make sure you pack the beta blockers for Dad," Lance said, finally pouring himself a glass. He is nervous about the speech. He will not admit it. But his tremor is coming back. "I already packed them," I said. I double-checked the dosage. "He will be fine as long as he does not mix it with grapefruit juice like he did last Thanksgiving." Lance nodded, taking a sip of water, He pulled his phone out of his silk pajama pocket. I watched him out of the corner of my eye. His thumb moved rapidly across the screen, typing a message. When he sensed my gaze, he angled the screen away, a reflex that had become increasingly common over the last 3 months. I used to know his passcode. It was my birthday, last week. When I tried to unlock his phone to check a dinner reservation time, the code did not work. When I asked him about it, he muttered something about a security update from the IT department at Sterling Wellness requiring an alphanumeric password. I knew it was a lie. I knew IT protocols better than he did, but I was too tired to fight. I was always too tired lately. "We need to leave by 8 in the morning," Lance said, sliding the phone back into his pocket. "Mother wants to arrive at Emerald Cliff before noon to supervise the final setup. She is worried the florists are going to use the wrong shade of white lilies." "I will be ready," I said. He lingered for a second, as if he wanted to say something else. His eyes flickered toward me, and for a brief moment, I saw a flash of something that looked like guilt, or perhaps it was just pity. Then the mask slammed back into place, the smooth, indifferent expression of a man who had been trained since birth to hide his feelings. "Good night, Kira," he said, and then he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with the hum of the refrigerator and the plastic box full of secrets. The next morning was a blur of high-pressure logistics. The trip to Emerald Cliff was not just a family vacation, it was a coronation. The estate, perched on a dramatic promontory overlooking the Atlantic, was the spiritual home of the company. This weekend, amidst the champagne and the press coverage, Preston was officially stepping down, and Lance was stepping up as CEO. I was packing my suitcase in the guest room. I had started sleeping there 2 weeks ago, claiming that my on-call shifts at the hospital were disrupting Lance's sleep. He had not argued. He had not even asked me to stay. I folded my favorite navy blazer, smoothing out the wrinkles. It was a sensible piece of clothing. Professional and understated, I liked clothes that made me feel armored. Victoria Sterling appeared in the doorway. She did not knock. In the Sterling house, privacy was a privilege, not a right, and certainly not a right extended to the daughter of a public school teacher and a mechanic. Victoria was 60 years old, but looked a decade younger. Thanks to the very expensive dermatologists I recommended to her and the facelifts she denied having. She was wearing a cream-colored cashmere travel set that probably cost more than my first car. Her eyes, identical to Lance's, swept over my open suitcase with open disdain. "Are you really planning on wearing that?" she asked, pointing a manicured finger at my blazer. "It is going to be chilly by the coast, Victoria," I said, continuing to pack. "I want to be comfortable." "Comfort is for people who do not have a legacy to uphold," she snapped. Stepping into the room, "This weekend is about the future of Sterling Wellness. Kira, the press will be there. The board of directors will be there. We need to project vitality, aspiration, that jacket projects, administration." "I am a pharmacist, Victoria," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I am an administrator of medicine. It is who I am." She sighed, a dramatic exhalation that signaled her profound disappointment in my existence. "It is a shame you never quite grasped the aesthetic of this family. Lance needs a partner who shines, not one who absorbs light. You look so washed out. Dear, have you been taking your iron supplements?" I took a deep breath, counting to 3 in my head. This was her game. She picked at me until I snapped, and then she would play the victim, claiming I was unstable or emotional. I refused to give her the satisfaction. "I am perfectly healthy," I said. "Is there something you needed?" She checked her diamond-encrusted watch. "Yes, the Vitality blend. I want you to prepare a batch for the road, and enough for the entire weekend. We will need it to stay sharp, and do not let the kitchen staff touch it. The last time that incompetent girl tried to mix it, she used synthetic vitamin C instead of the organic acerola cherry extract. I could taste the metallic finish for days. The Vitality blend. It was the holy grail of the Sterling daily routine. A neon orange concoction that tasted like battery acid and burnt oranges, but which Victoria swore was the secret to her boundless energy. In reality, it was a hyper-concentrated mixture of electrolytes, caffeine extracted from green tea, high-dose B vitamins, and a specific peptide powder that I had to special order from a lab in Switzerland. It was a volatile mixture. If the ratios were off, it could cause heart palpitations or severe nausea, because of my background in chemistry. Victoria had decided 3 years ago that I was the only person on Earth qualified to mix it. I was the bartender of their biological enhancement. "I will make it," I said. I was just about to go down to the lab. We called the small prep room off the kitchen the lab because it sounded more impressive, but it was essentially a wet bar stocked with beakers and precision scales instead of gin and tonic. "Make sure you do," Victoria said, turning to leave. "And try to put on some lipstick before we leave. You look like a corpse." I watched her walk away, the click of her heels echoing on the hardwood floor. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. It was not just the insults. I was used to the insults. It was the dismissal. There was a finality in her tone today, as if she had already decided that my presence was a temporary inconvenience that would soon be rectified. I went down to the prep room and began the procedure. I pulled on a pair of latex gloves, the snap of the rubber against my wrist feeling familiar and grounding. I lined up the canisters, the orange powder, the white crystalline caffeine, the dense, chalky peptides. I measured everything with the precision of a machine. 200 grams of the base, 50 milligrams of the booster. I swirled the mixture in the large glass carafe, watching the powder dissolve into the liquid until it was a smooth, vibrant orange. It looked innocent. It looked like orange juice, but I knew the chemical potency hidden inside. I poured the liquid into the specialized glass travel bottles, sealing each one with a vacuum cap. I labeled them with the date and time, my handwriting sharp and angular: Victoria Sterling, Preston Sterling, Lance Sterling. I stared at Lance's bottle. I remembered the first time I made this for him, shortly after we were married. He had looked at me with such admiration, telling his friends that his wife was a genius who could engineer the perfect fuel for his body. Now, I was just the staff member who ensured he did not crash during his big speech. I packed the bottles into a cooler bag, placing them carefully between ice packs. When I walked out to the driveway 20 minutes later, the convoy was already assembled. The Sterlings did not travel lightly. There were 2 black SUVs, gleaming under the morning sun, their engines idling with a low, expensive purr. The drivers were loading the mountain of Louis Vuitton luggage into the trunks. I walked toward the first SUV, assuming I would be riding with Lance. I reached for the door handle, but it was locked. The window slid down silently. Lance was in the driver's seat, wearing oversized aviator sunglasses that hid his eyes. Victoria was in the passenger seat. Adjusting the climate control, Preston was in the back, reviewing a stack of documents. "There is not enough room in here for the cooler and your bags," Kira Lance said, not looking at me. His voice was muffled by the glass. "Mother needs the extra legroom in the back for her dress bags. We do not want them to wrinkle." I blinked. Looking at the massive vehicle, it sat 7 people comfortably. There was plenty of room. "I can put the cooler in the trunk," I said. "It is already full," Lance said, cutting me off. "Just take your car. It is better that way. You can leave early if you get called into the hospital for an emergency or something. You know how unpredictable your job is." I had taken the entire week off. He knew that. I had put in the request 2 months ago specifically for this event. "Okay," I said, my voice sounding hollow in the open air. I stepped back from the car. "We will see you there," Victoria called out from the passenger seat, not even bothering to look up from her phone. "Try not to be late. The gates can be tricky if you do not have the transponder." The window rolled up. The SUV pulled away, gravel crunching under the tires. The second SUV, carrying the personal assistants and the styling team, followed close behind. I stood alone in the driveway of the house that was legally half mine, holding a cooler full of performance-enhancing juice for a family that would not even let me sit in the same car as them. I walked to my sedan, a practical, reliable vehicle that I had bought with my own money 3 years ago. It looked small and gray next to the empty space where the SUVs had been. I placed the cooler on the passenger seat, strapping it in with the seatbelt as if it were a fragile passenger. I I started the engine. The drive to Emerald Cliff was 3 hours north. Winding along the coastline, it was a beautiful drive, usually, but as I shifted the car into gear and pulled out onto the street, I could not shake the feeling that I was driving toward an execution. Lance's evasion, the changed password, the separate cars, the way Victoria looked at me, not with hatred, but with the cold indifference one shows to an object that has outlived its usefulness. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I was the clinical pharmacist. I dealt in facts, in symptoms, in diagnosis. And the diagnostic signs were screaming at me. Something was wrong. The ecosystem of the Sterling family had shifted, and I was no longer a symbiotic organism within it. I was becoming a pathogen, and the Sterlings had a very aggressive protocol for eliminating pathogens. I merged onto the highway, following the distant taillights of my husband's car, unaware that I was driving straight into a trap that would force me to use every ounce of my chemical knowledge not to heal, but to survive. Emerald Cliff did not welcome visitors. It tolerated them. The estate was carved into the granite face of the Maine coastline, a sprawling architectural boast of glass and steel that looked less like a home and more like a fortress designed to keep the unworthy at bay. As I navigated the winding coastal road, the ocean churned gray and violent 300 feet below, crashing against the rocks with a sound that vibrated through the chassis of my sedan. I had been driving for nearly 4 hours. The GPS coordinates Lance had sent me led away from the manicured cypress-lined main driveway. Instead, the navigation voice, cool and detached, directed me down a narrow, potholed service road that ran along the perimeter of the dense pine forest behind the estate. I pulled up to a rusted iron gate marked with a sign that read, "Service deliveries and staff entry only." A security guard I did not recognize stepped out of the booth, his face obscured by the brim of his cap. He held a clipboard, looking at my modest car with the kind of suspicion reserved for trespassers. "Name," he barked, not bothering to offer a greeting. "Kira Sterling," I said, rolling down the window. "I am Lance Sterling's wife." He frowned, scanning the list on his clipboard. He flipped the page, then flipped it back. "I do not have a Mrs. Sterling on the guest arrival manifest. I have you listed here under support staff and vendor deliveries. Kira Fairchild." The name hit me like a physical slap. I had legally taken Lance's name 5 years ago. To be listed by my maiden name, in the vendor column, was not a clerical error. In the Sterling world, nothing was ever an error. It was a calibration. "Just open the gate, please," I said, my voice tight. "I am late." He shrugged, pressing a button inside the booth. The gate groaned open, slow and reluctant. "Drive around to the loading dock behind the kitchens. The main courtyard is reserved for valets and luxury transport only." I drove through, the tires crunching over loose gravel. I parked next to a refrigerated catering truck and a van from a commercial florist. I grabbed the cooler bag containing the Vitality blend, slung my garment bag over my shoulder, and walked toward the back entrance. I had to navigate through the chaos of the industrial kitchen, dodging chefs shouting orders and waiters polishing silver trays. Before I finally emerged into the main foyer of the house, the silence here was different. It was expensive. The air smelled of white tea and money. The foyer was a cavernous space with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the Atlantic Ocean as if it were a painting commissioned solely for the family's enjoyment. And there they were. The tableau before me was perfect, terrified in its symmetry. Preston sat in a leather armchair, swirling a glass of amber liquid. Victoria was perched on the edge of a velvet sofa, her posture rigid, her laughter tinkling like broken glass. Lance stood by the fireplace, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a champagne flute. But the focal point of the room was not my husband or his parents. It was the woman standing next to Lance. She was tall, with hair the color of spun honey cascading down her back in waves that looked effortless, but likely cost $1,000 to style. She wore a silk jumpsuit in a shade of emerald green that perfectly matched the name of the estate, cinched at the waist to highlight a figure that was athletic yet curvaceous. This was Serafina Blackwood, I recognized her instantly from the society pages and industry journals. She was the daughter of Senator Blackwood and the founder of Lumina, a high-end medical spa chain that was the direct competitor to Sterling Wellness. As I stood there, clutching my cooler bag like a delivery girl, I watched Serafina laugh at something Lance said. She leaned in, her hand brushing his bicep, her fingers lingering on the fabric of his jacket for 3 seconds too long. It was a touch that screamed familiarity. It was the kind of touch that claimed territory. Lance did not pull away. He leaned into it. The sound of my heels on the marble floor finally alerted them to my presence. The laughter died abruptly, sliced off as if by a guillotine. 4 pairs of eyes turned to me. "Oh, look," Victoria said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that barely masked the venom beneath. "The pharmacist has arrived, and just in time." She did not say hello. She did not ask about my drive. She looked pointedly at the cooler bag in my hand. "I hope you brought enough vitamins, dear," Victoria continued, gesturing vaguely toward the group. "We are going to need a lot of energy. We have very distinguished guests this weekend, and we cannot afford to look tired." I walked forward, my spine stiffening. I felt gritty from the road, my clothes wrinkled from the drive, standing before people who looked like they had been vacuum-sealed in perfection. "Hello, Victoria." "Preston," I said, nodding to them. I turned to Lance. His eyes met mine for a fraction of a second before darting away to look at the rug. "Kira," he said, his voice flat. "You made it. And you must be Kira," Serafina said, stepping forward. She extended a hand, her wrist adorned with a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the light. "I have heard so much about you. Lance tells me you are the wizard behind the curtain who keeps everyone running." Her handshake was firm, her skin cool and dry. Her eyes, a piercing shade of blue, analyzed me with predatory intelligence. There was no warmth there, only assessment. She was calculating my value, my threat level, and finding both negligible. "Serafina is joining us for the weekend," Lance said quickly. As if reading from a script, "We are discussing a potential strategic partnership between Sterling Wellness and Lumina. It is a merger of philosophies." "A merger," Serafina echoed, her smile widening. She looked up at Lance, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made my stomach turn. "We think our brands could be very powerful together. Unstoppable, really." I stood there, the unwanted third wheel in my own marriage, holding a bag of glorified orange juice. The dynamic in the room was suffocating. I was the technician, the help, the person who kept the machinery running so the beautiful people could play. "I should go get settled," I said, breaking the silence. "It has been a long drive." "Of course," Victoria said, waving her hand dismissively. "Go refresh yourself. You look a bit weathered." I turned and headed toward the grand staircase. The master suite, the room Lance and I had shared for the last 4 summers, was on the 2nd floor, occupying the east wing with the best view of the sunrise. I ascended the stairs, feeling the weight of their gazes on my back until I turned the corner. I walked down the plush-carpeted hallway, passing the portraits of sterling ancestors who seemed to glare at me with the same disapproval as their living descendants. I reached the double doors of the master suite. I pulled the keycard from my pocket, the one I had kept in my wallet since last summer, and slid it into the slot. A red light blinked. I tried again. Red light. I frowned. Wiping the magnetic strip on my blazer, I tried a third time, slower. The mechanism whirred and clicked, but the handle remained locked. The red light pulsed. A digital denial of entry. "Maybe the battery is dead," I whispered to myself, though I knew the maintenance staff at Emerald Cliff checked these locks weekly. "Kira." I turned around. Lance was standing at the top of the stairs. He had not come closer. He stood 10 feet away, maintaining that ocean of distance between us. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, swirling the champagne in his glass. "The key is not working," I said, holding up the card. "Yeah," Lance said, clearing his throat. "About that. We had to make a slight change to the rooming assignments." "A change?" I asked, my grip tightening on the card. "We have more VIPs than we anticipated," Lance said, his eyes focusing on a sconce on the wall behind me. Senator Blackwood decided to join Serafina at the last minute, and we needed to give him the suite next to ours. And Serafina, well, she needs the East Suite for her styling team. They have a lot of equipment. So where am I sleeping, Lance? I asked. My voice was calm, but my heart was hammering against my ribs. I put you in the garden room, Lance said. It is cozy, and it is quieter. You said you wanted to rest, right? The garden room. It was a euphemism. It was a small guest room on the ground floor, tucked behind the kitchen pantry and the industrial laundry facility. It was the room they usually gave to the private chef or the nanny. It had no view of the ocean, only a window that looked out onto the delivery driveway where I had parked. You gave my room to your business partner, I stated. It is just logistics, Kira Lance snapped, his defensiveness flaring up. Why do you have to make everything personal? This is the biggest weekend of my life. I need everything to go smoothly. I need the Senator and Serafina to be happy. Can you just be a team player for once? A team player. That was the phrase he always used when he wanted me to accept less than I deserved. Fine, I said. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. Good, Lance said, looking relieved that I had not caused a scene. The staff already moved your things down. Just try to stay out of the way until dinner. Okay, Serafina and I have a lot of prep work to do for the presentation. He turned and walked back toward the laughter and the light, leaving me standing in the hallway. I walked back down the stairs, past the foyer, past the library, and through the swinging doors that led to the service corridor. The air here was hotter, smelling of roasting meat and bleach. I found the door to the garden room and pushed it open. It was tiny. A single bed was pushed against the wall. The furniture was mismatched, pieces that had been retired from the main rooms upstairs. The window was high and small, letting in a square of gray light. Through the thin walls, I could hear the heavy thrum of the commercial washing machines in the laundry room next door, a rhythmic, mechanical pounding that vibrated through the floorboards. I set the cooler on the small desk. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the mattress sagging under my weight. I was the wife of the heir apparent, the future CEO of Sterling Wellness, and I had been relegated to the servants' quarters while another woman unpacked her silk dresses in the room that was supposed to be mine. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of lemon detergent and despair. I closed my eyes, visualizing the anatomy of the heart, the 4 chambers, the valves, the electrical impulses that kept it beating even when it was breaking. I stood up. I had a job to do. I had to unpack. I had to steam my dress. I had to prepare the evening medications. I walked out to the car to get my suitcase, trying to ignore the sound of Serafina's laughter drifting down from the balcony above. Ringing out clear and victorious over the roar of the ocean, I did not know it then, but the room assignment was only the first cut. The real surgery was about to begin. I walked out of the cramped, subterranean garden room with a singular mission. I needed to retrieve my luggage. I had accepted the humiliation of the room change because I was a professional. And professionals do not throw tantrums when the logistics shift. I told myself that I could handle the basement. I could handle the noise of the industrial dryers. As long as I had my clothes, I could put on my armor and face the sharks upstairs. I had spent 6 months saving for this weekend. My salary at Vanguard Memorial was respectable, but it did not stretch to the kind of couture the Sterlings considered casual wear. I had quietly put away money from every paycheck, skipping lunches and picking up extra graveyard shifts, to purchase a gown that would finally make me look like I belonged. It was a midnight blue silk slip dress, elegant and understated, tailored to within a millimeter of my life. I had packed it in a specialized garment bag, along with the vintage pearl earrings my grandmother had left me, the only heirloom I possessed. I stepped out into the service courtyard. The air was colder now, the wind whipping off the Atlantic with a biting chill. I walked to my sedan, the gravel crunching loudly under my sensible flats. I popped the trunk. The lid swung open with a hydraulic hiss. I blinked. I reached out and touched the gray felt lining of the trunk floor. It was empty. My breath hitched in my throat. I looked around, thinking perhaps I had made a mistake. Maybe I had taken the bags out and left them by the door when I brought the cooler in. No. I had only taken the cooler and my shoulder tote. The two large suitcases and the garment bag had been right here. I slammed the trunk shut and ran back toward the service entrance. My heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Those bags contained everything. My clothes, my toiletries, my contact lenses, my dignity. I burst into the kitchen. The staff stopped their chopping and stirring, looking at me with wide, wary eyes. They knew. I could see it in the way the sous chef suddenly became very interested in his diced onions. "Where is Arthur?" I demanded, my voice echoing off the stainless steel counters. The head butler appeared from the pantry. Arthur had been with the Sterlings for 30 years. He was a man of impeccable discretion, usually as unreadable as a stone statue. But today, he looked at me and his left eye twitched. He held a silver polishing cloth in his hands, wringing it like a nervous rag. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I mean, Miss Fairchild, where are my bags?" "Arthur," I asked, stepping closer to him. "My trunk is empty. I know I left them there. Did the valets move them to the garden room?" Arthur swallowed hard. He looked toward the back door, then back at me. His face was pale. "Miss Fairchild, I was instructed—" He trailed off, unable to meet my gaze. "I was instructed to clear the vehicle to ensure it did not violate the visual aesthetic of the service yard," Miss Bella said. Bella, Lance's younger sister, the one who treated cruelty like a competitive sport. She said what Arthur. She said the vehicle needed to be moved to the lower lot, and that the contents were to be processed. Processed. "Where are my things?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and dread. Arthur raised a shaking hand and pointed toward the far end of the service yard, past where the cars were parked, toward the high concrete walls that hid the estate's waste management system. "They are by the recycling processors, ma'am." I turned on my heel and ran. I pushed through the heavy metal doors. Stumbling out into the cold afternoon light, I sprinted past my empty car, past the delivery vans, toward the row of industrial dumpsters that lined the back wall. The smell hit me first. It was the smell of discarded excess rotting lobster shells, stale champagne, wilting flowers, and wet cardboard. And there, piled next to the blue recycling bin like refuse, were 3 black, heavy-duty trash bags. I stopped. My knees felt weak. I recognized the shape of my hard-shell suitcase protruding against the strained plastic of one bag. "No," I whispered. "No, they would not." I walked forward, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the plastic. I ripped open the first bag. A wave of nausea rolled over me. Inside was my wardrobe. But it was not just packed. It was destroyed. My clothes had been shoved in with reckless violence. My blouses were twisted and crushed. But worse, there was a dark, viscous liquid coating them. Coffee grounds, wet. Used coffee grounds had been dumped directly into the bag. I pulled out a silk blouse, the cream one I wore to the hospital board meetings. It was stained brown, ruined beyond repair. I dug deeper, ignoring the slime on my fingers. I found my underwear, my bras, my stockings, all tangled together in a wet, humiliating heap. I tore open the second bag. This one contained the garment bag. The zipper had been ripped open. I pulled out the midnight blue dress. It had been slashed. A long, jagged tear ran from the neckline to the hem, as if someone had taken a pair of fabric shears to it in a fit of manic energy. I fell to my knees on the cold concrete. I held the ruined dress against my chest, the silk cold and damp. 5 years of trying, 5 years of swallowing my pride, of accepting their insults, of trying to prove that I was good enough, that I could be polished into a sterling, and this was the answer. They did not just want me gone. They wanted me obliterated. They wanted to strip me of the very clothes on my back. Then I saw it. Stuck to the side of the ripped garment bag was a bright neon yellow sticky note. The cheerfulness of the color made my stomach churn. I peeled it off. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was loopy, girlish, and sharp Bella's handwriting. "Cleaning out the closet. Need space for Seraphina's stuff. These old rags don't fit the party vibe." I stared at the note. Old rags? This dress cost me $2,000. I had eaten instant noodles for 3 months to buy it, and to them, it was just trash to be cleared away to make room for the mistress. Something inside me snapped. It was not a loud snap. It was the quiet, terrifying sound of a cable parting under too much tension. The tears that had been threatening to fall suddenly evaporated. The heat in my face cooled into a block of ice. I stood up. I dropped the ruined dress back onto the pile of garbage. I wiped my hands on my skirt, leaving streaks of coffee grime on the fabric. I did not care. I turned back toward the house. I did not run this time. I walked. I walked with the rhythmic, predatory pace of a hunter. I stormed through the kitchen, ignoring the gasps of the staff who saw the filth on my hands. I pushed through the swinging doors into the main house. I walked past the library, past the salon where the laughter was still ringing out. I climbed the grand staircase. My footsteps were heavy, thudding against the marble. I reached the second floor. The door to the master suite, the room that should have been mine, was standing wide open. I walked in. The room was bathed in golden afternoon light. It smelled of lavender and expensive leather, and it was full of activity. Serafina Blackwood was standing in the center of the walk-in closet, my closet. She was holding a hanger with a white Valentino gown, the plastic covering crinkling softly. The closet, which had once held my modest collection of blazers and slacks, was now bursting with color. Rows of designer dresses, furs, and silk robes were jammed onto the racks. Lance was sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through his tablet. I did not knock. I walked straight into the room. Lance looked up. His eyes widened when he saw my disheveled appearance and the dirt on my hands. "Kira," he said, standing up, "what happened to you? You look like you have been digging in the dirt." I ignored him. I looked straight at Serafina. Serafina turned, still holding the Valentino gown. She blinked, her expression shifting into a mask of innocent confusion that was so perfectly crafted it deserved an award. "Oh. Hello, Kira," she said, her voice light and airy. "We were just organizing. There is so much less storage space here than I am used to." "You threw my clothes in the trash," I said. My voice was low, deadly quiet. Serafina's eyebrows shot up. "The trash." "Oh, goodness. No. Bella said she was handling the storage situation. I told her I needed the closet space for the weekend. You know how many changes of clothes these events require, and she said she would move your things to a more appropriate location." "My underwear is covered in coffee grounds," I said, taking a step closer to her. "My dress, the one I bought for the gala, is slashed. It is sitting by the dumpster next to the fish guts." Lance stepped between us, holding up his hands. "Okay, let us calm down," he said. "Kira, you are being hysterical." "Hysterical," I repeated, looking at my husband. He was defending the woman who had just usurped my bedroom. "Bella probably just made a mistake," Lance said, shrugging. "You know how she is. She is efficient. She probably thought those were the donation bags. You have to admit, a lot of your clothes do look, well, lived in." I stared at him. The cruelty was so casual it took my breath away. "It was not a mistake, Lance," I said, holding up the sticky note. I shoved it into his chest. "Read it." He took the note. He read it. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. But it was not directed at his sister. It was directed at me, for making him deal with this. "Look, I will write you a check," Lance said, crumpling the note and tossing it into the wastebasket that sat beside the bed we used to share. "Go buy something new. There is a boutique in the village. Just buy something appropriate and stop making a scene. Serafina is trying to get ready." Serafina sighed. A soft, tragic sound. "I really did not mean to cause an inconvenience," she said, looking at Lance with wide, doe eyes. "I just assumed since you were staying in the garden room, you would not need the master closet. Lance told me you preferred the simpler accommodations. He said you found this room too ostentatious." I looked from her to him. "You told her I did not want this room," I asked. Lance ran a hand through his hair. Exasperated. It was a white lie. "Kira, to make things smoother, Serafina is our guest of honor. She needs the space. Why are you so obsessed with material things? It is just a room. It is just clothes. It is my life, I whispered. Don't be dramatic, Lance snapped. You are staying for the weekend. You are still my wife on paper. Just play the part. Go down to the village, buy a dress, and get cleaned up. You smell like garbage. I looked at him, really looked at him. For 5 years, I had convinced myself that beneath the layers of privilege and entitlement, there was a good man, a man who loved me. But standing there, watching him dismiss the destruction of my property as a minor inconvenience while his mistress hung her clothes in my closet, the illusion finally shattered. There was no good man. There was only a hollow shell, filled with the same rot as the rest of his family. I looked at Serafina. She was smiling at me. It was a small, triumphant smile. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was marking her territory, and I was the stain she was scrubbing away. I understand, I said. The calm that washed over me was sudden and absolute. It was the calm of a surgeon who realizes the limb cannot be saved and must be amputated, good Lance said, mistaking my resolve for submission. I knew you would be reasonable. Here. He pulled a money clip from his pocket and peeled off a stack of bills without counting them. He thrust them at me. Get something nice, but not white. Serafina is wearing white. I took the money. I did not throw it back in his face. I did not scream. I folded the bills neatly and put them in my pocket. I will get cleaned up, I said, and I will make sure everything is ready for the party. Thank you, Serafina said, turning her back to me to resume hanging her gown. You are a dear. I walked out of the room. I walked back down the hallway. My dirty hands clenched into fists at my sides. They thought they had broken me. They thought that by throwing my clothes in the trash, they had thrown me away. They thought that by taking my room, they had taken my power, but they had made a fatal error. They had stripped me of the one thing that was keeping them safe, my desire to be one of them. I was no longer Kira Sterling, the desperate wife trying to fit in. I was Kira Fairchild, the clinical pharmacist, and I had a diagnosis to make. I went back down to the garden room. I stripped off my ruined clothes and stood under the shower, scrubbing my skin until it was raw. I washed away the coffee grounds. I washed away the smell of the dumpster. When I stepped out, I did not put on the spare clothes I had in my tote. I put on a pair of hospital scrubs I kept in the bottom of my bag for emergencies. I sat at the small desk and opened my laptop. I logged into the hospital database. Then, I logged into the Sterling Wellness internal network, a network I had access to because I managed the family's medical records. I was not just going to leave. I was going to perform an extraction. But first, I needed to see just how deep the infection went. I needed to know exactly what they were planning to announce at that gala. I opened the file labeled a merger_strategy_final, and as I read, the plan formed in my mind. It was precise, it was chemical, and it was absolutely devastating. They wanted space for Serafina Fine. I would give them all the space they needed. I would clear the room. I would clear the stage. I would clear their entire digestive tracts. I closed the laptop. The time for tears was over. The time for the laxatives had begun. The dining room at Emerald Cliff was designed to intimidate. It was a cavernous hall with vaulted ceilings and a long mahogany table that could seat 30 people, illuminated by a chandelier that looked like a frozen explosion of crystal. When I walked through the double doors, the conversation did not stop, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I was not wearing the midnight blue silk gown I had saved for months to buy. That dress was currently sitting in a dumpster, soaking up coffee grounds and fish oil. Instead, I was wearing a gray pencil skirt and a white button-down shirt, the emergency outfit I kept in the wheel well of my trunk for unexpected hospital board meetings. It was wrinkled. It smelled faintly of rubber and stale trunk air. Against the backdrop of black tie elegance, I looked like a member of the catering staff who had gotten lost on the way to the kitchen. Lance sat at the head of the table. He looked devastatingly handsome in his tuxedo, the very image of the corporate prince, to his right. In the seat of honor, the seat that had been mine for the last 5 years, sat Serafina. She was radiant in a shimmering silver gown that clung to her like liquid mercury. Her hand rested possessively on the table, inching closer to Lance's wine glass. There was no chair for me next to my husband. I scanned the table. The only empty setting was at the far end, sandwiched between Great Aunt Mildred, who was deaf in one ear, and a distant cousin named Julian, who was currently under investigation for tax fraud. "Ah, there she is," Victoria said from the opposite end of the table. She did not stand up. She held her wineglass by the stem, swirling the vintage red liquid. "We were wondering if you were going to join us, or if you had decided to eat in your room, though, looking at your attire, perhaps room service would have been the more appropriate choice." "My luggage was lost," I said, my voice steady. It was a lie, and everyone at the table knew it. But in the Sterling family, we did not speak of trash bags and dumpsters at the dinner table. We spoke in euphemisms. "How unfortunate," Serafina said, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. She leaned toward Lance, whispering something that made him chuckle. I walked the length of the table, the click of my sensible work heels echoing loudly against the marble floor. A waiter pulled out the chair for me. I sat down, unfolding the heavy linen napkin on my lap. I felt like a gray smudge on a pristine canvas. The conversation resumed, flowing around me like water around a rock. They were not talking about the weather or the food. They were talking about the merger. "It is really about synergy," Serafina was saying, gesturing with her fork. "Sterling Wellness has the heritage, the infrastructure, but Lumina has the youth demographic. We have the influencers. We have the vibe. If we merge the portfolios, we control 80% of the luxury wellness market on the East Coast." Lance nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. The board is ready to approve it. We just need to finalize the branding. The public needs to see this as a marriage of equals, a union of two dynasties." He used the word marriage. He was talking about a corporate merger, but his eyes were locked on Serafina. The subtext was so loud it was practically screaming. This was not just about stock options. This was an announcement. I sliced my steak, the knife scraping against the china. "And where does that leave the clinical side?" I asked. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the chatter. Everyone stopped eating. Lance looked down the table at me, annoyed. "What do you mean?" he asked. "Sterling Wellness is built on science," I said. "Or at least, it claims to be. If you pivot entirely to lifestyle and influencers, what happens to the medical credibility? What happens to the oversight?" Victoria laughed. It was a dry, brittle sound. "Oh, Kira, you are always so literal. That is your problem. You see the world in molecules and dosage charts. We are selling a dream. We are selling perfection. Nobody wants to hear about clinical trials. They want to look like Serafina." She gestured to the woman in silver. Serafina preened, tilting her chin up. "Victoria is right," Serafina said, looking at me with pity. "The modern consumer wants aspiration, not prescription. Frankly, the clinical approach is a bit sterile. It lacks soul. We need passion. We need heat. And you provide the heat," I asked. Serafina smiled, a slow, predatory curving of her lips. "I provide the spark. Lance provides the fuel. That is how you build an empire." I looked at Lance. I waited for him to defend me. I waited for him to say that my work, the work that ensured their products didn't poison people, was valuable. He took a sip of wine. "Kira, let us not talk shop tonight. You are boring the guests. Boring." I looked down at my plate. The filet mignon looked like a lump of ash. I felt a cold numbness spreading through my chest. I was not a wife here. I was not even a guest. I was an obstacle, a relic of a past mistake that they were actively trying to erase. The dinner dragged on for another hour. They talked about the gala tomorrow night. They talked about the photo shoot for the cover of Forbes. They talked about the honeymoon suite at the resort in Bora Bora, where they planned to host the post-merger retreat. I ate mechanically, tasting nothing. As the dessert course was being cleared, a delicate pear tart that looked too beautiful to eat, Victoria tapped her spoon against her glass. "Before we retire to the library for brandy," she said, her eyes fixing on me, "Kira, I need you to handle a few things." She did not ask. She commanded. "Preston is feeling a bit arrhythmic tonight," she said. "I need you to go down to the kitchen and check his beta blocker supply. Make sure the dosage for tomorrow is prepared. And while you are down there, you need to mix the Vitality blend for the gala." "Now?" I asked. "Yes." Now Victoria said, "We need it to chill overnight to activate the peptides. You know the drill. And please, use the filtered water from the glass jugs, not the tap. I do not want chlorine ruining the profile." The table went silent. The humiliation was absolute. She was sending me away from the table like a servant to go mix their juice. Lance did not look up. He was busy peeling the foil off a chocolate mint. "Of course," I said. I stood up. I placed my napkin on the table. I walked out of the dining room. I could feel their eyes on my back. Could feel the collective relief that the gray smudge was finally removing itself from the picture. I did not go straight to the kitchen. I needed air. I needed a moment to stop my hands from shaking. I turned down the corridor that led to the library, intending to cut through to the service stairs. The library door was slightly ajar. I heard voices inside, low, urgent voices. I stopped. I knew those voices. One was Lance. The other was Marcus Vance, the family's shark of a lawyer. I pressed myself against the wall. Holding my breath. "The paperwork is ready," Marcus was saying. The sound of papers shuffling was crisp in the quiet hallway. "We just need her signature. But Lance, you have to be careful. The prenuptial agreement has a fidelity clause. But it also has a public image clause." "I know," Lance said. His voice sounded impatient. "That is why we are doing it this way. If she causes a scene," Marcus continued, "if she looks unstable, if she looks unpresentable, we can argue that she has violated the clause. We can argue that her behavior is damaging the Sterling brand. That voids the alimony settlement. So she gets nothing," Lance asked. "She gets what she came with," Marcus said, "which, if I recall correctly, is a student loan debt and a used sedan." I closed my eyes. A tear leaked out, hot and angry. This was the plan. They did not just want to divorce me. They wanted to destroy me financially. They wanted to provoke me, to break me, to make me look crazy so they could cast me aside without paying a dime. That was why they threw away my clothes. That was why they locked me out of the room. They were trying to manufacture a breakdown. "She will sign," Lance said. He sounded confident. He sounded like a stranger. "Kira is weak. She is a pleaser. She thinks if she follows the rules, she will be rewarded. She has no idea how the real world works." I heard a third voice join the conversation. It was Serafina. She must have slipped in through the side door connecting the dining room. "Is it done?" she asked. "Almost," Lance said, "just waiting for the right moment." "God, she is exhausting," Serafina sighed. The sound of ice clinking in a glass followed. Sitting there in that awful polyester skirt. She looks like a high school librarian. "I do not know how you tolerated it for 5 years." "Lance, she was useful," Lance said. "She kept my parents healthy. She organized the meds. She is good at logistics. She is a lab rat," Serafina said. The venom in her voice was pure and distilled. "That is all she is. A little gray mouse running in a wheel, thinking she is going somewhere. But mice do not belong in palaces. Lance, they belong in cages, or in the disposal. A lab rat." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I pulled away from the wall. My heart was not racing anymore. It had slowed down to a cold, heavy thud. Useful. A mouse. A lab rat. They thought I was weak because I served them. They thought I was stupid because I was silent. They thought my knowledge of chemistry was just a domestic convenience, like knowing how to fold a fitted sheet. I turned and walked toward the kitchen. I did not stomp. I did not cry. I moved with the silent, terrifying purpose of a predator that has finally decided to stop playing with its food. They wanted a lab rat. Fine, I would give them a lab rat, but they seem to have forgotten one crucial thing about lab rats. We are the ones who test the poisons. I pushed open the swinging doors to the kitchen. The staff looked up, startled by my sudden entrance. "Mrs. Sterling," Arthur began. I walked past him. I walked past the prep stations. I walked straight to the secure pantry where the medicines were kept. "I am just here to do my job," I said, my voice calm and devoid of all emotion. "Victoria wants her vitamins." I unlocked the cabinet. I took out the bottles. I took out the compounds. They wanted me to mix the vitality blend. They wanted me to prepare the beta blockers. They wanted me to ensure their hearts kept beating rhythmically while they plotted to destroy my life. I looked at the vials in my hands. Serafina was right. I was a scientist. I understood cause and effect. I understood reaction and counter-reaction. I set the bottles on the counter. I reached for the mortar and pestle. "You think I am a mouse?" I whispered to the empty air. I began to grind the pills. Let us see how the lions run when the mouse poisons the water hole. The medical suite at Emerald Cliff was hidden behind a discreet oak panel in the hallway connecting the kitchen to the staff quarters. It was a space that did not appear on the architectural blueprints shown to Architectural Digest. To the public, the Sterlings were genetic marvels who maintained their vigor through yoga and the company's signature algae supplements. In reality, this 200-square-foot room, sterile and humming with the sound of a pharmaceutical-grade refrigerator, was the only thing keeping them upright. I punched in my 6-digit code on the keypad. The lock disengaged with a heavy mechanical thud. I stepped inside, and the motion sensors bathed the room in a harsh, clinical white light. This was my domain. The rest of the house might belong to Victoria's aesthetic or Lance's ego, but this room belonged to my license. The shelves were lined with amber bottles, neatly labeled in my handwriting. There was an EKG machine in the corner, an oxygen tank, and a crash cart that I checked religiously every month. It was a fully functional urgent care unit, designed to handle everything from a hangover to a heart attack, ensuring that a Sterling never had to suffer the indignity of a public waiting room. I walked to the main computer terminal and logged in. The screen flickered to life, displaying the family's electronic health records. I needed to verify the current inventory before I mixed the morning doses. But as I scrolled through the recent logs, the sheer magnitude of their hypocrisy hit me harder than usual. I pulled up Preston's file first. The man who was giving a speech tomorrow on the importance of liver detoxification and pure living had liver enzyme levels that were 3 times the normal limit. His blood pressure was a ticking time bomb, managed only by the high-dose beta blockers I administered daily. He was not a beacon of health. He was a walking stroke risk preserved in alcohol and denial. I switched to Victoria's chart. The woman who claimed her glowing skin came from the Sterling Marine Collagen line was actually on a heavy regimen of prescription retinoids and a rotating cocktail of benzodiazepines to manage her neurotic perfectionism. Her zen demeanor was chemically induced. If I missed a dose of her anti-anxiety meds, the facade would crack within 4 hours, revealing the terrified, controlling narcissist beneath. But it was when I accessed the inventory logs for the last 48 hours that I paused. There were discrepancies. I saw entries for a supply drop that I had not authorized. A private courier had delivered a package yesterday, signed for by Lance. The contents were listed under a generic code used for nutritional samples, but the lot number did not match any supplier in the Sterling database. I turned to the secure refrigerator. On the bottom shelf, behind the insulin that Preston's diabetic brother used when he visited, was a sleek, silver box. It looked like packaging for a high-end perfume, but the label was in Mandarin and German. I put on a pair of nitrile gloves and opened the box. Inside were rows of glass vials containing a clear liquid. I held one up to the light. There was no FDA approval stamp, no safety seal, just a chemical compound number. I recognized the structure immediately. It was a gray-market sympathomimetic amine, a designer stimulant that was popular in the underground modeling world in the early 2000s before it was banned for causing cardiac arrhythmias. It was a metabolic incinerator. It forced the body to burn fat at a terrifying rate, stripping weight off in days. But the cost was a massive spike in heart rate and body temperature. I went back to the computer and cross-referenced the delivery time with Lance's recent vitals, which were monitored by his smartwatch and uploaded to the server. My breath caught in my throat. Lance's resting heart rate had been sitting at 110 beats per minute for the last 12 hours. That was near tachycardia levels. And then I saw the second user profile linked to the new device sync, Serafina Blackwood. Her data was merging with the system because she had connected her fitness tracker to the house network. They were both taking it. I leaned back in the ergonomic chair, the cold realization washing over me. They were doping. for the merger, for the photo shoot. They wanted to look razor-sharp, lean, and godlike for the cameras. So they were injecting themselves with unapproved stimulants that revved their metabolisms into the red zone. This explained everything. It explained Lance's edginess at dinner. It explained the sweat on his forehead. It explained Serafina's manic energy and the slight tremor I had noticed in her hands when she was hanging the dress. And suddenly, the Vitality blend made perfect sense. I looked at the formula for the blend that Victoria insisted on. It was heavy on magnesium, L-theanine, and high-dose CBD oil. I had always thought it was just to soothe their nerves. But looking at the interaction profile now, I realized it was a physiological necessity. The Vitality blend was the antidote. The magnesium acted as a muscle relaxant to stop the twitching caused by the stimulants. The L-theanine counteracted the caffeine jitters. Without the Vitality blend to smooth out the edges, the drugs Lance and Serafina were taking would make them shake like leaves in a gale. They would be sweating profusely. Their jaws would clench, and they would look like addicts going through withdrawal, not wellness icons. They needed me. They needed my potion to mask the poison they were voluntarily pumping into their veins. They were dependent on the very lab rat they despised to keep their biological house of cards from collapsing. I let out a short, humorless laugh. The irony was exquisite. I stood up to go to the compounding station, but a flash of light caught my eye. On the stainless steel counter, next to the centrifuge, lay an iPad. It was Lance's. He must have left it here when he came to hide the silver box in the fridge. The screen had timed out. But as I watched, a notification banner lit up the glass. It was a message from Serafina. Did you see the look on her face when she realized she had to wear that ugly skirt to dinner? Priceless? My hand hovered over the device. I knew I should not look. I knew that reading it would only hurt. But the scientist in me needed all the data. I needed to know the extent of the pathology. I swiped the screen. Since I was already inside the secure medical network, the device did not ask for a passcode. It assumed I was an authorized user. I opened the message thread. It was a stream of mockery. Photographs of me eating alone at the end of the table. A video of me walking to the kitchen. Zoomed in on my sensible shoes with a caption that read, "Nurse Ratched reporting for duty." But then I scrolled up to a message sent 3 hours ago. It was a photo taken inside the service courtyard, near the dumpsters. It was a close-up of my lace underwear, the expensive set I had bought for our anniversary last year, draped over a pile of coffee grounds. The lace was torn, stained brown, and looked pathetic against the garbage. Serafina's caption read, "Look at these parachutes. Seriously. Lance, how did you ever get aroused by this? It looks like something my grandmother would use to strain pasta. Thank God we cleared out the trash." Lance had replied with a laughing with tears emoji. "She is just a placeholder." He had written back, "A utility bill I have to pay until the contract is up. Don't worry, babe. The future is sleek. The future is us." I stared at the screen, the image of my intimate clothing, exposed and ridiculed in a group chat between my husband and his mistress, burned itself into my retinas. They did not just hate me, they were disgusted by me. They viewed my existence as a clerical error they were correcting. To them, I was not a human being with feelings or dignity. I was just biology to be managed, a utility bill to be paid. The heat in my chest turned cold. It was the absolute zero of emotional detachment. I set the iPad down gently on the counter. I did not throw it. I did not smash it. That would be emotional. And I was done being emotional. Emotional people make mistakes. Scientists make plans. I looked at the silver box of stimulants. I looked at the bottles of magnesium and sedatives. If I refused to make the Vitality blend, they would just force someone else to do it, or they would muddle through. No, simply withholding my service was not enough. I needed to actively intervene. I needed to alter the variables. I looked at the interaction chart in my mind. Fact 1. They are taking a powerful stimulant that increases gut motility and heart rate. Fact 2. They rely on the Vitality blend to calm their muscles and stop the tremors. Fact 3. They have insulted my dignity, my profession, and my womanhood. If I removed the soothing agents from the Vitality blend, the tremors would return. That was step one. But if I replaced those soothing agents with something that accelerated the effects of the stimulants, something that targeted the gastrointestinal tract, which was already sensitized by their weight loss drugs, I turned to the locked cabinet where we kept the preparation compounds for colonoscopies and gastrointestinal surgeries. My eyes landed on a large white jug on the bottom shelf. Magnesium citrate, high concentration. Next to it was a bottle of bisacodyl drops, colorless, odorless, tasteless in a citric acid base. And finally, the nuclear option, a specialized osmotic laxative used for rapid bowel evacuation in emergency toxicology cases. It worked within 45 minutes to an hour. I did the math in my head. The stimulant increases peristalsis. The laxative liquefies the contents of the colon. The removal of the calming magnesium supplement removes the sphincter control. It was a perfect storm, a biological hurricane. And the best part? The Vitality blend was bright orange and tasted of sour citrus and acerola cherry. It was the perfect vehicle. It would mask the salinity of the magnesium citrate completely. They wanted to be clean. They wanted a detox. They wanted to purge the old to make way for the new. I reached for the box of fresh latex gloves. I pulled them on, the snap of the elastic sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. I am going to give them exactly what they want, I whispered to the humming refrigerator. I walked to the compounding station. I lined up the beakers. I adjusted the digital scale. I was not Kira the wife anymore. I was not Kira the victim. I was the clinical pharmacist. And I was about to dispense a lesson in physiology that the Sterling family would never, ever forget. The silence in the medical suite was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the sub-zero pharmaceutical refrigerator. It was a sound I had found comforting for 5 years, a binary white noise that signaled preservation and order. Now, however, it sounded like a countdown. I stood before the stainless steel compounding counter, my hands encased in fresh, powder-free nitrile gloves. The room was sterile, cold, and bright, a stark contrast to the dirty, chaotic emotions churning in my gut. But I pushed those emotions down, compressing them into a dense core of icy resolve. Emotions were variables that introduced error. I needed precision. I needed to be the scientist they mocked, the lab rat who knew exactly how to navigate the maze. I began the harvest. I moved to the secure storage cabinet, the one designated for gastrointestinal and operative preparation. This was where we kept the heavy artillery the drugs used to completely evacuate a patient's system before major abdominal surgery or colonoscopy. My hand closed around a large, opaque white jug, magnesium citrate. It was a hyperosmotic saline laxative. In the hospital, we called it liquid dynamite. It worked by pulling massive amounts of water from the body's tissues into the intestines, creating a tidal wave of pressure that the sphincter muscles could not possibly resist. Next, I found the bisacodyl. I bypassed the standard 5 milligram tablets and reached for the high-concentration liquid solution usually reserved for patients with severe opioid-induced constipation. It was a stimulant laxative. It did not just soften the stool. It irritated the nerve endings in the colon wall, triggering violent, spasmodic contractions. It was the biological equivalent of a riot. Finally, I reached to the back of the shelf for the nuclear option, a box of sodium picosulfate sachets, a rapid-acting bowel cleanser designed to scour the digestive tract clean in under an hour. I lined them up on the counter next to the ingredients for the Vitality blend, the organic acerola cherry powder, the synthetic B vitamin complex, and the electrolytes. I looked at the array. It was a chemistry set of catastrophe. I pulled the large glass mixing carafe toward me. This was the vessel. I started with the math. Pharmacology is, at its heart, an equation of mass, time, and absorption rates. Variable A. The target subjects, 4 adults, 2 of them, Lance and Serafina, were already in a state of hypermetabolism due to the illegal fat-burning stimulants they were injecting. Their hearts were racing, and their gut motility was already accelerated. Variable B. The timing, the schedule. Printed on thick cardstock and posted on the refrigerator door. Stated that the pre-gala family toast would take place in the VIP green room at 6 o'clock in the evening. The live broadcast and the keynote speeches would begin at 7 o'clock. Variable C. The onset of action. Magnesium citrate usually took 3 hours to work on a normal digestive system. That was too slow. But sodium picosulfate, when combined with a stimulant like bisacodyl and ingested on an empty stomach, which they all had, because they were fasting for the cameras, could induce total evacuation in as little as 45 minutes. If they drank the cocktail at 6 o'clock, the chemical reaction would begin its violent crescendo at exactly 6:45 by 7 o'clock. When the stage lights hit them and the cameras went live, the pressure in their abdomens would be reaching critical mass. I began the synthesis. I measured out the base for the Vitality blend. The acerola cherry powder was a deep, vibrant orange, and it was aggressively sour. This was crucial. Magnesium citrate has a distinct, salty, bitter taste that is difficult to hide, but the human tongue struggles to distinguish saltiness when it is overwhelmed by high acidity. The acerola was perfect camouflage. I poured 300 milliliters of the magnesium citrate into the carafe. The liquid was clear and slightly viscous. Next, I took the sodium picosulfate sachets. I tore open 4 of them, double the recommended dose for a single patient, and dumped the fine white powder into the liquid. I watched it dissolve, swirling the carafe gently. The liquid remained clear. Then came the bisacodyl. I used a pipette to draw up 20 milliliters of the concentrated solution. I added it drop by drop. Finally, I added the innocent ingredients, the B vitamins, the orange powder, the electrolytes. I picked up the glass stirring rod. The sound of glass clicking against glass was sharp and satisfying. As I stirred, the mixture turned the signature neon orange of the Vitality blend. I leaned in and sniffed. It smelled of citrus and artificial energy. It smelled exactly like the lie they sold to the public. I took a disposable pipette and placed a tiny drop on the back of my glove. I tasted it. Tart, citrusy, with a very faint, almost imperceptible metallic aftertaste that could easily be mistaken for the high dose of zinc they requested. It was perfect, but I was not done. I turned my attention to the second part of the equation control. Victoria Sterling relied on her beta blockers to keep her hands steady and her face dry under the hot stage lights. Without them, her anxiety would manifest as profuse sweating and uncontrollable tremors. I retrieved her prescription bottle from the daily meds tray. Propranolol, 40 milligrams. The pills were small, round, and white. I walked over to the general diuretic supply. I found a bottle of furosemide, also known as Lasix. It was a potent loop diuretic used to treat heart failure and edema. It forced the kidneys to dump water. The urgency it created was sudden and impossible to ignore. The furosemide pills were also small, round, and white. To the untrained eye or the arrogant eye that never bothered to check what the help was giving them, they looked identical. I emptied Victoria's beta blockers into a mortar. I crushed them into a fine powder and washed them down the sink, watching the white slurry disappear into the drain. Then, I filled her prescription bottle with the furosemide. I recapped the bottle. I wiped it down with an alcohol swab to remove my fingerprints, even though I was wearing gloves. Now, let us review the physiological cascade I had just engineered. Victoria would take her calming pill at 5 o'clock. Instead of slowing her heart rate, the pill would do nothing to stop her adrenaline. In fact, within 30 minutes, the furosemide would hit her kidneys. Filling her bladder with urgent, painful pressure, she would be sweating from anxiety, shaking from the lack of beta blockers, and desperately needing to urinate. Then, at 6 o'clock, she and the rest of them would drink the Vitality blend. The magnesium citrate would draw liters of water into their intestines. The sodium picosulfate would liquefy everything else. The bisacodyl would trigger violent spasms, and because Lance and Serafina were on stimulants, Their systems would process this toxic soup at lightning speed. I poured the spiked vitality blend into the 4 personalized glass travel bottles I had prepared earlier. Lance, Serafina, Victoria, Preston. I screwed the caps on tightly. I used the heat gun from the packaging station to shrink wrap a fresh plastic seal over each cap. I had a roll of Sterling Wellness branded safety seals in the drawer, another task they had delegated to me because the factory seals were too hard to open. Now, they looked factory fresh, pristine, untouched. I placed the bottles on the silver serving tray. They glowed under the fluorescent lights. Bright and cheerful. They looked like health. They looked like vitality. They were actually 4 hand grenades with the pins pulled. I checked the clock on the wall. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. 2 hours until ingestion. 3 hours until detonation. I began to clean up my workstation. I washed the carafe 3 times with bleach. I wiped down the counters. I disposed of the empty sachets and the pipette in the biohazard bin, which would be incinerated by the medical waste company on Monday. I stood there for a moment, looking at the tray. A normal person might have felt guilt. A wife might have felt hesitation. But I did not feel like a wife anymore. The woman who had cried over a torn dress in the service yard was gone. She had been excised, like a tumor. In her place stood the clinical pharmacist. And the pharmacist knew that sometimes the only cure for a systemic infection is a total purge. They wanted to flush me out of their lives. They wanted to discard me like waste. I picked up the tray. The glass bottles clinked softly, a cheerful toast to the coming apocalypse. "You want to get rid of the filth in this house," I whispered to the empty room, my voice flat and cold. "I am happy to facilitate the process." I turned off the lights. The room plunged back into darkness, save for the green glow of the refrigerator temperature display. I walked out of the medical suite. The tray balanced perfectly in my hand. I walked toward the VIP green room, my steps silent on the plush carpet. I was the invisible hand of fate, delivering a prescription that was long, long overdue. The morning of the gala dawned with the kind of aggressive brightness that felt manufactured, as if the Sterlings had paid the sun to shine specifically for their broadcast. The entire estate was buzzing with frantic energy. Production crews were running cables through the hallways. Sound technicians were testing microphones in the ballroom, and floral designers were constructing an archway of white orchids that cost more than my entire college education. I moved through the chaos like a ghost. I had spent the night in the garden room, not sleeping, but rehearsing. I had rehearsed my facial expressions, my tone of voice, the precise angle of my shoulders. Today, I had to be more than just a pharmacist. I had to be an actress. I found Lance in the breakfast solarium. He was alone, staring at his reflection in the glass door while he adjusted his cufflinks. He looked tired. The stimulants were keeping him awake, but they were also eating away at his reserves. His eyes were wide and wired, his movements jerky. "Lance," I said softly. He jumped, spinning around. "God, Kira, do not sneak up on me like that." "I am sorry," I said, keeping my head lowered. "I just wanted to tell you, I have made a decision." He narrowed his eyes, bracing himself for a fight. "About what?" "About us," I said. I paused, letting a tremor enter my voice. It was fake. But he did not know that. "You were right. I do not fit in here. I never have. And seeing Serafina with you, I realize now that I was just holding you back." Lance's posture relaxed instantly. The tension in his shoulders evaporated. He looked at me with a mixture of relief and condescending pity. "I am glad you finally see it, Kira," he said, stepping closer. "It does not mean you are not a good person. It just means we are on different trajectories." I took a deep breath. "I will sign the papers," I said, "the ones Marcus prepared. I will sign them today, and I will leave before the gala starts. I do not want to be a distraction." Lance smiled. It was the smile of a man who had just won a high-stakes bet without having to play the final hand. That is very mature of you, Kira." "Thank you. Really. I will make sure Marcus adds a generous severance package. You deserve a fresh start." "A fresh start," I echoed. "Yes, that is exactly what I want." Just then, Victoria swept into the room. She was already in her makeup chair robe, her hair set in rollers. "What is going on here?" she demanded, looking between us. "Kira is leaving," Mother Lance said, beaming. "She is signing the papers and heading back to Boston before the guests arrive." Victoria stopped. She looked at me, her eyes searching for a trap, but I kept my face blank, projecting nothing but defeat and resignation. "Well," she said, smoothing the lapel of her robe, "that is probably for the best. No sense in dragging out the inevitable." She checked her watch. "But before you go, there is one last thing." I waited. I knew this was coming. "The pre-show regiment," she said. "We are all meeting in the VIP green room at 5:30 for final prep. I want you to bring the medication tray and the vitality blend. I do not trust the catering staff to handle the supplements correctly. And honestly, it is the least you can do after all the trouble you have caused with your moodiness this weekend." It was a final power play, even in my defeat. She wanted me to serve them one last time. She wanted to reinforce the hierarchy. I was the servant, and they were the masters. "Of course, Victoria," I said. "I have everything prepared." "Good," she said, turning away. "Make sure the blend is chilled, and do not be late. We have a schedule to keep." I walked away, hiding the smile that threatened to break through my mask. They had just invited the executioner to the scaffold. The hours passed in a blur of final preparations. I packed my bag, my real bag, the one with my laptop and my hard drives, and put it in my car. I checked out of the garden room. I was ready to ghost. At 5:25, I went to the medical suite refrigerator. I took out the silver tray. The 4 bottles of Vitality Blend were cold and covered in condensation. Beside them sat the small porcelain dish containing Victoria's beta blockers, the potent diuretics I had swapped in. I walked through the service corridors, avoiding the main halls where the guests were starting to arrive. I reached the VIP green room, a secluded lounge behind the main stage. I knocked. "Come in," Lance's voice called out. I pushed the door open. The room was a sanctuary of luxury. Cream leather sofas, soft lighting, and a massive mirror where they were all admiring themselves. They looked magnificent. I had to give them that. Lance was in a bespoke tuxedo that fit him like a second skin. Preston looked distinguished in black tie, though his face was flushed red from the blood pressure. Victoria was wearing a gold sequined gown that shimmered like armor. And Serafina, she was in the white Valentino gown. It was a masterpiece of design, strapless and structured, hugging her curves and flaring out at the bottom. It was the color of innocence, worn by a woman who had none. "Ah, the juice lady is here," Serafina said. Turning from the mirror, she checked her lipstick in the reflection. "Just in time. I am feeling a little crash coming on." I walked to the low table in the center of the room and set the tray down. "Here you go," I said, my voice steady. "The evening regimen." I picked up the bottle labeled Victoria and handed it to her, along with the small dish of pills. "Your beta blockers, Victoria," I said, "to keep the hands steady." "Thank you," she said, tossing the pills into her mouth and washing them down with a swig of the orange liquid. She grimaced slightly. "It tastes a bit sharp today." "I added extra vitamin C," I said quickly, "for the immune support. You know how germy these crowds can get." She nodded, accepting the explanation. She took another long drink, draining half the bottle. I handed the next bottle to Preston. "For the heart," I said. He grunted, unscrewing the cap and downing it in one go. "Good. I need the energy." Then I turned to Lance and Serafina. I picked up their bottles, the ones laced with the extra magnesium citrate to react with their stimulants. Lance took his. "Thanks, Kira," he said, not meeting my eyes. Serafina took hers. She looked at me, a smirk playing on her lips. "You know, it is actually really sweet of you to do this," she said. "Even after everything. I guess you really do care about the family brand." "I do," I said. "I want you all to make an impression that no one will ever forget." She laughed. "Well, cheers to that." She clinked her bottle against Lance's. They both tilted their heads back and drank. I watched the neon orange liquid disappear down their throats. I watched their Adam's apples bob. I watched them swallow the hurricane. They finished the bottles. Lance wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Okay," he said, clapping his hands together. "Let us do this. Showtime in 40 minutes. Serafina turned to me. "Well, I guess this is goodbye," she said. "I hope you find whatever it is you are looking for. Someone more your speed. Maybe a nice dentist?" I smiled. It was the most genuine smile I had worn in years. "Thank you, Serafina," I said. "And I hope you have a truly moving evening. I hope everything flows exactly as it should." She frowned slightly, sensing something odd in my phrasing, but she dismissed it. She turned back to the mirror to adjust her hair. I turned to Victoria. "Goodbye, Victoria," I said. "Break a leg." She waved a hand at me, already focused on her reflection. "Just go, Kira, and close the door on your way out." I walked to the door. I paused with my hand on the handle. I looked back at them one last time. 4 beautiful, perfect people, standing in their expensive clothes, completely unaware that inside their bodies, a chemical countdown had just ticked past the point of no return. I stepped out into the hallway and closed the door softly. The moment the latch clicked, I started moving, but I did not go to my car. Not yet. I walked swiftly toward the tech booth. I had one last stop to make. I found the AV technician, a guy named Mike, who I had known for years. He was the one who had been fired by the Sterlings last year for theft after he tried to claim overtime pay, only to be rehired as a freelance contractor because no one else knew how to run the complex sound system. "Mike," I said, slipping into the dark booth. "Kira," he said, surprised. "I thought you were banned from the production area." "I am leaving," I said, "but I wanted to give you this." I handed him a USB drive. "What is it?" he asked. "It is the backup visual file for the presentation," I lied smoothly. "Lance thinks the current file might be corrupted. He wants you to queue this one up as a failsafe, if the main presentation glitches. Switch to this immediately." Mike looked at the drive, then at me. He hated the Sterlings. He knew how they treated people. "Is there anything weird on it?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I looked him dead in the eye. "Just the truth, Mike. Just the absolute, unvarnished truth about the Sterling legacy." He grinned, a slow, conspiratorial grin. "I will keep it on standby," he said, plugging it into the main console. "Safe travels, Kira." I left the booth. I walked out the side exit of the mansion, into the cool evening air. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and red. I walked to my car, got in, and locked the doors, but I did not start the engine. I pulled out my phone and opened the livestream app. The Sterling Wellness 40th Anniversary Gala was trending. The viewer count was already at 2 million and climbing. I propped the phone up on the dashboard. I was not going to miss this. I had front row seats to the end of the world. I checked my watch. 5:45, 15 minutes. The magnesium was dissolving. The sodium picosulfate was activating. The furosemide was filtering into Victoria's bladder. I leaned back in the seat and waited. The silence in the car was heavy, but it was not lonely. It was the peaceful silence of a scientist waiting for the reaction to complete. I did not leave the estate. The GPS on my phone showed the route back to Boston, but I stayed parked in the shadows of the lower lot. The engine off, the windows cracked open to let in the salty air. The dashboard glowed with the light of my phone screen, streaming the live feed from the ballroom just a few hundred yards away. But watching on a small screen was not enough. I needed to see the data points in real time. I slipped out of the car, pulling a black hoodie over my head to cover my hair. I moved through the service entrance I knew so well, bypassing the kitchen where the staff was in a frenzy plating appetizers, and slipped into the back of the AV control booth. Mike, the technician, saw me enter. He did not say a word. He just nodded and angled one of the preview monitors toward me so I could see the stage from a high-definition, wide-angle perspective. The ballroom was a sea of diamonds and black velvet. The cream of East Coast society was there: senators, tech moguls, influencers, and investors. They were sipping champagne and waiting for the royal family of wellness to descend from on high. The music swelled a triumphant orchestral piece that sounded like the soundtrack to a superhero movie. The lights dimmed, and a spotlight hit the top of the grand staircase. "Here they come," Mike whispered. The Sterlings appeared. They looked magnificent. From a distance, they were the embodiment of health and success. Preston led the way, followed by Victoria in her gold armor. Then came Lance and Serafina, the new power couple, holding hands and waving to the crowd. They descended the stairs to thunderous applause. Flashbulbs popped like lightning storms. I checked my watch. 6:40. It had been exactly 40 minutes since ingestion. The absorption phase was complete. The osmotic pressure phase was beginning. They took their places on the stage. There were 4 high stools arranged in a semicircle, designed to look casual and conversational. They sat down. I zoomed in on the monitor. The first sign was subtle. It was Victoria. She was smiling, waving to the crowd. But her left foot was tapping, not tapping to the music, tapping with a frantic, irregular rhythm. She shifted her weight on the stool, crossing her legs, then uncrossing them, then crossing them again tightly. The loop diuretic, the furosemide, was hitting her kidneys. Her bladder was filling rapidly, creating an urgent, painful pressure that was fighting against her pelvic floor muscles. Next to her, Preston was gripping the armrest of his stool so hard his knuckles were white. His face, usually flushed, had gone a strange shade of gray-green. He was sweating, not the light sheen of stage perspiration, but heavy, beaded sweat that rolled down his temples. He leaned slightly toward Victoria. I adjusted the audio feed on the console, isolating the stage microphones. They were not live to the house yet, but they were live to us in the booth. "Victoria," he hissed. "My stomach. It feels like a washing machine." "Keep smiling," Victoria whispered back through her frozen smile. "It is just nerves. Do not slouch." "It is not nerves," Preston groaned. "It is cramping. Bad." And then there was Lance. My husband was usually the picture of composure. But now, he looked like he was vibrating. The stimulants in his system were reacting with the magnesium citrate. His metabolism was churning, and his gut was contracting. He kept running his hand over his stomach, a reflexive gesture of distress. He turned to Serafina. "Babe," he whispered, "are you okay?" "You are shaking." Serafina was not just shaking, she was trembling. The white Valentino gown was strapless and structured with internal boning. It was a corset. It was tight. And as her intestines began to swell with water drawn from her body, that dress was becoming a torture device. I feel sick," she whispered, her voice breathless. "I feel really hot. And my stomach. It is making noises. I could hear it, even over the ambient noise of the crowd." The sensitive stage mics picked up a low, ominous gurgle from her abdomen. It sounded like a drain unclogging. "Lance, I need to go to the bathroom," Serafina said, panic rising in her eyes. "Like, now. You can't," Lance hissed. "The broadcast is starting in 2 minutes. We are live to 2 million people. Just hold it." "I can't hold it," she squeaked. "It hurts." Mike looked at me, his eyes wide. "Holy, what did you give them?" "Just a little clarity," I said. Watching the monitor, the master of ceremonies walked onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the visionaries behind Sterling Wellness." The applause roared. The house lights went down, leaving only the spotlight on the 4 of them. They were trapped by the light, trapped by the cameras, trapped by their own vanity. Victoria stood up to take the microphone. She wobbled. She had to grab the back of the stool to steady herself. "Welcome, friends," she said. Her voice was tight, strained. "We are so honored to have you here tonight." She paused, taking a shallow breath. She clamped her thighs together visibly. The diuretic was relentless. Every second she stood there was agony. "Tonight," she continued, a bead of sweat dripping off her nose. "Tonight we celebrate purity. We celebrate control." Behind her, Preston let out a low moan. He was bent over at the waist, clutching his stomach. "Dad," Lance whispered, reaching out a hand. "Do not touch me," Preston growled. If I move, it is going to happen. What is going to happen? Lance asked. The dam is going to break, Preston said. The audience was starting to notice. A murmur rippled through the front row. People were squinting, whispering to each other. Why was the CEO sweating so much? Why was the new face of the company shaking? Serafina let out a sharp gasp. The bicicodal had just triggered a peristaltic wave. A massive cramp ripped through her intestines. She doubled over, clutching her midsection. Oh God, she whimpered into her lapel mic, which was unfortunately now live. Oh God, it hurts. The sound echoed through the ballroom. Serafina Victoria hissed, turning around, momentarily forgetting her own bladder crisis. Stand up. You are embarrassing us. I can't, Serafina cried. It is coming. What is coming? Victoria demanded. Mike looked at me. Should I cut the feed? No, I said, my voice hard. Keep it rolling. Zoom in. On the screen. Lance looked terrified. He stood up, trying to shield Serafina from the cameras with his body. We are having a technical difficulty, folks, he stammered into his mic. Just a moment, but it was too late for technical difficulties. The biology was in charge now. Preston let out a loud belch, followed by a sound that no amount of money could silence, the wet, churning roar of a stomach in full revolt. The audience gasped. Mom, Lance said, panic in his voice. Mom, I think I'm going to be sick. Hold it together, Victoria shrieked, her facade finally cracking. We are live. But you cannot command a chemical reaction. You cannot negotiate with a laxative. Serafina stood up abruptly. I think she intended to run off stage, but the movement was too sudden. The pressure in her gut shifted. She froze. Her eyes went wide with horror. She looked down at her pristine white dress. Don't, I whispered in the booth. Don't try to run. It is over. On stage, Serafina's knees buckled. She grabbed Lance for support. Lance, she screamed. And then, the sound happened. It was amplified by the high-quality sound system, a wet, tearing noise. Squelch. The back of Serafina's white dress, right below the waist, suddenly turned a dark, terrifying brown. The stain expanded rapidly, soaking into the expensive silk, spreading like an ink blot test from hell. The audience screamed. It was a collective sound of shock and revulsion. Serafina wailed, a high-pitched sound of pure humiliation. She tried to cover herself with her hands, but it was everywhere. It was running down her legs. It was pooling on the white stage floor. Oh my God, someone in the front row shouted. Lance backed away from her in horror, slipping on the slick surface of the stage. He fell hard, landing in the mess. Lance Victoria screamed, "Get up!" But as she screamed, her own control failed. The furosemide won. A dark patch appeared on the front of her gold-sequined gown, spreading down her thighs. She had wet herself. The Iron Lady of Sterling Wellness was standing in a puddle of her own urine. Preston did not even try to stand. He simply slumped forward off his stool, vomiting violently onto the stage floor. It was a symphony of fluids, a ballet of bodily functions. The camera operators didn't know what to do. They kept filming. The livestream comments were scrolling so fast they were a blur. OMG, is this real? The Wellness family is exploding sterling mess. Mike looked at me, his jaw on the floor. You did this? I looked at the screen. I looked at the people who had treated me like dirt. I looked at the husband who had laughed at my underwear in the trash. I looked at the mistress who had stolen my room. They were no longer gods. They were just people. Sick, scared, humiliated people wallowing in their own filth. Switch the feed, I said to Mike. What? Switch the visual feed, I said. To the USB drive. Now! Mike's fingers flew across the console. He hit the button, on the massive screen behind the stage. The logo of Sterling Wellness disappeared. In its place, a new image appeared. It was a screenshot of the group chat, the photo of my underwear in the trash. The text from Lance. She is just a utility bill. The text from Serafina. Looks like something my grandmother would use to strain pasta. Then, the next slide, a split screen. On one side, the family's medical records showing the illegal stimulant abuse. On the other side, A video clip of them throwing my clothes into the dumpster. The audience went silent. The screaming stopped. They were reading. They were seeing the truth. I leaned into the microphone in the booth, which was connected to the Voice of God PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice echoing through the ballroom, calm and professional. "You came here to see the truth about the sterling lifestyle. Well, here it is. It is toxic, it is fake, and it is full of shit." I took my finger off the button. I turned to Mike. "I think my work here is done," I said. I pulled my hoodie up. I walked out of the booth, leaving the chaos behind me. I walked out to my car, the cool night air hitting my face. Behind me, I could hear the sirens approaching, but they were not coming for me. They were coming for the victims of a very unfortunate, very public, biological disaster. I had stopped at the exit, my hand on the cold metal bar of the door, ready to push it open and leave the Sterling estate forever. But the scientist in me refused to walk away before the reaction had reached its terminal phase. You do not conduct an experiment of this magnitude and then leave before the data is fully collected. I turned back. I slipped into the darkness of the AV booth, just as the stage lights flared for the grand finale. On the stage, the atmosphere was thick enough to choke on. The air conditioning was humming at full blast. But the four people under the spotlight were melting. Lance was holding the microphone. He was supposed to be announcing the merger, the dawn of a new era for Sterling wellness. Instead, he looked like a man being held hostage by his own digestive tract. He was swaying on his feet, his face a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. We are thrilled," he stammered, his voice cracking, "to introduce Serafina." He gestured toward his mistress. Serafina did not wave. She did not smile. She was gripping the edges of her stool with such force that her acrylic nails were digging into the leather. Her face was drained of blood, leaving her complexion a sickly, translucent white that matched her Valentino gown. She was breathing in short, shallow gasps, terrified that any movement of her diaphragm would trigger the catastrophe brewing in her lower intestine. And then, Preston tried to save the moment, the patriarch of the family, the man whose face was on every bottle of liver support supplements, leaned forward to intercept the awkward silence. He grabbed his own microphone. He opened his mouth to speak, likely to deliver one of his rehearsed lines about strength and endurance, but his body had other plans. The sound that emerged was not a word. It was not human. It began low, a deep, resonant rumble from the depths of his abdomen, picked up by the high-fidelity lapel microphone clipped to his tie. It sounded like tectonic plates shifting. It sounded like a clogged drain suddenly giving way under immense pressure. Gurgle. The sound was amplified by the $1 million surround sound system. It boomed through the ballroom, vibrating the crystal glasses on the tables. It was a wet, churning, violent noise that went on for 3 seconds. Then 4, then 5. The audience went deathly silent. 200 of the wealthiest people in America froze, their champagne glasses halfway to their mouths. Preston clapped a hand over his mouth, his eyes bulging, but the sound was not coming from his throat. It was coming from his gut, broadcasting his biological failure to the world. Victoria, sensing the humiliating spiral, attempted to intervene. She was the general. She was the fixer. She tried to stand up, likely to signal for a commercial break or to distract the crowd. We need a moment," she gasped. She took a step toward center stage, but the furosemide I had swapped for her beta blockers had drained her equilibrium along with her fluids. Her legs were shaky. Her bladder was screaming. She took one step, and her heel caught on the hem of her gold-sequined dress. She went down. It was not a graceful fall. It was a heavy, clumsy collapse. She hit the floor hard on her hands and knees, and then the dam broke. The sudden impact shattered whatever fragile control she had left over her bladder. A dark, unmistakable stain began to spread rapidly across the back of her gold gown. It soaked into the expensive fabric, turning the shimmering gold into a dull, wet bronze. The puddle expanded on the white stage floor beneath her, glistening under the unforgiving spotlights. A collective gasp ripped through the audience. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. Victoria Lance shouted, dropping his microphone. The feedback screech was deafening. He moved to help her, but the movement on stage was the final trigger for Serafina. The sight of Victoria collapsing, the screech of the audio feedback, and the sheer terror of the situation overwhelmed Serafina's nervous system. The bisacodyl and magnesium citrate combination, supercharged by the stimulants, hit its peak. She screamed. It was a blood-curdling shriek, high and thin. No, she wailed. She tried to stand, perhaps to run, perhaps to hide behind the podium. But gravity and biology were working against her. As she rose, her body betrayed her completely. The pristine white Valentino gown, the symbol of her victory. The dress that had replaced me was instantly destroyed. A torrent of brown fluid exploded down the back of the dress, soaking through the silk in seconds. It ran down her legs. It pooled around her silver heels. She collapsed back onto the stool, sobbing hysterically, creating a scene of absolute grotesque horror. The smell hit the front row first. It was not a subtle odor. It was the acrid chemical stench of a chemically induced purge. It was the smell of sickness and rot, amplified by the heat of the stage lights. I saw the wife of a prominent tech billionaire in the front row gag. She covered her nose with her diamond-encrusted clutch and scrambled backward, knocking over her chair. "Oh my God. What is that smell?" someone shouted. "It is shit," someone else yelled, their voice filled with disbelief. "They are shitting themselves." Chaos erupted. The carefully curated image of the Sterling family dissolved into a literal cesspool. Lance, standing amidst the wreckage of his family, looked from his mother lying in a puddle of urine to his mistress sobbing in a pool of excrement. The stress, the smell, and the interaction between the stimulants and the magnesium in his own system created a perfect storm of nausea. He doubled over. He did not even have time to turn away. He projected vomit directly into the massive arrangement of white orchids at the front of the stage. The sound of his retching echoed through the speakers. Joining the chorus of Serafina's wails and the crowd's screams, the guests were fleeing. It was a stampede of tuxedos and ball gowns. People were pushing each other to get to the exits, desperate to escape the smell and the secondhand embarrassment. "Cut the feed," Victoria screamed from the floor. Her voice ragged. "Cut the damn feed." But Mike, the technician next to me, did not cut the feed. He looked at me, his hands hovering over the console, waiting for my signal. "Do it," I said, my voice cold and hard. I reached past him and hit the master override button myself. On the massive LED screen behind the stage, the shimmering logo of Sterling Wellness vanished. The image of the perfect family vanished. In its place, a new slide appeared. It was 50 feet tall. It was a high-resolution scan of the medical toxicity report I had compiled. It showed the levels of illegal amphetamines in Lance and Serafina's blood. It showed the prescription records for Victoria's antipsychotics. It showed the liver damage markers for Preston. And next to it, I projected the photos. The photo of the trash bags next to the dumpster. The photo of my torn dress. The photo of my underwear covered in coffee grounds. And the text messages. "She is just a utility bill, a lab rat. Mice belong in cages." The crowd that had not yet made it to the doors stopped. They turned. They looked up at the screen. They looked back at the people on stage, who were now wallowing in their own filth. The contrast was devastating. The juxtaposition of the arrogant text messages with the reality of the shamed, soiled figures on stage was a piece of art darker than anything in a museum. I leaned into the microphone one last time. "They threw out my clothes to keep their image clean," I said, my voice booming over the chaos, calm and detached. "But you cannot clean a house that is rotten to the foundation." I hit the final key on the keyboard. The slogan I had prepared flashed onto the screen in bold. Blood-red letters, superimposed over the image of the Sterling family cowering on the floor. The truth about Sterling health, hollow and rotten. Lance looked up at the screen. He saw the messages. He saw the medical records. He looked toward the AV booth, his eyes wild and searching. He knew, in that moment, through the vomit and the shame, he finally knew who had done this. "Kira," he screamed, his voice breaking. "Kira." But I was already turning away. The smell was starting to reach the back of the room, and I had no intention of staying for the cleanup. The data collection was complete. The hypothesis had been proven. The sterling dignity was a myth, and I had just dissolved it with a few dollars worth of over-the-counter medication. I walked out of the booth, stepping over a coil of cable. I walked down the service corridor, listening to the beautiful music of sirens approaching in the distance. The ambulance was coming. The press vans were coming. The end of the Sterling Empire was arriving with flashing lights and loud noises. I pushed open the heavy exit door and stepped out into the night. The air was crisp and clean, smelling of pine and ocean salt. It was the freshest air I had breathed in 5 years. I walked to my car, my heels clicking a steady, victorious rhythm on the pavement. I did not run. I did not hide. I walked like a woman who had just finished a very long, very difficult shift and was finally, officially, off the clock. The sirens cut through the coastal silence like a scalpel through flesh. I stood by the open door of the ballroom, watching the chaotic symphony I had conducted reach its final crescendo. I had made the call 10 minutes ago. Using a burner phone I had purchased with cash at a gas station 3 towns over. My voice had been trembling with feigned panic as I told the 911 operator that there was a mass poisoning event at the Sterling estate, hinting that it looked like a chemical attack. That specific phrasing, chemical attack, ensured that the response was not just an ambulance, it was a fleet. Police cruisers, fire trucks, and hazmat units screeched into the driveway, their blue and red lights bouncing off the terrified faces of the fleeing guests. The guests, the cream of society who had paid thousands of dollars to be here, were now scrambling over the manicured lawns in their evening gowns. Desperate to escape the smell of ruin, I stepped back into the shadows of the wings, watching the authorities storm the stage. "Freeze, police," a SWAT officer screamed, his rifle raised, but nobody on stage could freeze. They were already paralyzed by their own biology. The scene under the spotlights was biblical in its filth. The stage, which had been a pristine white platform of wellness just an hour ago, was now a biohazard zone. Victoria was still on her hands and knees in the puddle of her own urine, her gold dress ruined, her makeup streaking down her face in terrifying rivulets. Preston was unconscious, slumped over his stool in a pile of vomit. Serafina was curled in a fetal position, sobbing into the floor. The back of her white dress a testament to the effectiveness of the magnesium citrate. And Lance, my husband, the CEO, he was trying to crawl toward the edge of the stage, gasping for air, looking like a man drowning on dry land. The paramedics rushed past the police, their boots splashing in the mess. They were professionals, trained to handle trauma and gore, but even they recoiled when the smell hit them. The mixture of sulfur, ammonia, and high-stress fear pheromones was overwhelming. "Identify the toxin," the lead paramedic shouted. Kneeling beside Lance, "We need to know what they ingested." I leaned against the heavy velvet curtain, watching. This was the moment, the second phase of my prescription, back in the green room. When I had handed them their bottles of spiked vitality blend, I had done one more thing. I had been a dutiful wife and a helpful friend. I had brushed lint off Lance's jacket. I had adjusted Serafina's purse strap. And with the sleight of hand, I had perfected handling delicate vials in the lab. I had slipped the remaining supply of their illegal stimulants directly into their possession. "Check his vitals," the paramedic yelled. "His heart rate is through the roof. He has tachycardia, 180 beats per minute." They ripped open Lance's tuxedo jacket to attach the defibrillator pads. As they tore the fabric, a silver case fell out of his inner breast pocket. It clattered loudly onto the stage floor. Popping open, glass vials rolled out. They spun through the filth, glinting under the lights. The police officer stepped forward, his boot stopping one of the vials. He picked it up. Reading the label, he looked at the paramedic. He looked at Lance. "This is not food poisoning," the officer said, his voice grim. This is a Schedule 1 controlled substance. This is illegal methamphetamine-based stimulant. He reached down and patted Lance's other pocket. He pulled out a bag of pills, the unlabeled sedatives they used to come down from the high. "We have possession with intent," the officer announced. Simultaneously, another medic was attending to Serafina. She was clutching her designer clutch bag as if it contained the cure. The medic tried to move it to check her pulse. But she resisted. In the struggle, the bag fell. The clasp snapped open. More vials, more pills, and a syringe kit. The camera operators, who had been frozen in shock, suddenly woke up. Mike, my ally in the booth, had zoomed the main camera in tight. The image was broadcast to the 2 million people still watching the live stream. They saw the drugs. They saw the needles. They saw the police officer reading the Miranda rights to a man lying in his own vomit. The Sterling wellness empire was not just dying, it was being arrested. It was time for my curtain call. I stepped out from the wings. I was not wearing the ruined dress. I was not wearing the servant's uniform. I was wearing a sharp, tailored black suit I had bought with my own savings 3 weeks ago. Anticipating a job interview that I never went to, my hair was pulled back in a severe, clean bun. My face was scrubbed fresh. I looked like the only sanitary thing in a world of infection. I walked onto the stage. My heels did not touch the filth. I navigated the disaster zone with the precision of a surgeon avoiding a contaminated field. The police officer looked up at me. "Ma'am, you need to stay back. This is a crime scene." "I am his wife," I said calmly, flashing my hospital ID. "I am a clinical pharmacist. I can tell you exactly what is happening to them." Lance heard my voice. He lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with red, filled with a level of agony that transcends physical pain. He saw me standing there, towering over him, clean and untouched. "Kira," he rasped. His voice was a broken wheeze. "Kira, help me." I stopped 2 feet away from him. The smell was horrific, but I did not flinch. I stared down at him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen in a petri dish. "Help you," I repeated, the antidote he begged, reaching a shaking hand toward my ankle. His fingers were stained. You know what to do. Please, it burns. Make it stop." The paramedic looked at me. "Ma'am, if you know what they took, you need to tell us." I looked at the paramedic. "They have ingested a combination of illicit sympathomimetic amines and a high-concentration osmotic laxative cocktail," I said, my voice clear and loud enough for the boom mic to catch. "Their bodies are currently purging the toxins they voluntarily injected. It is a violent reaction, but it is not fatal. It is merely cleansing." I turned my gaze back to Lance. "You want a cure, Lance?" I asked softly. He nodded desperately, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the sweat and the grime. "Yes, please. I will give you anything. I will give you the house. I will give you the money. Just stop the pain." I crouched down. I did not touch him. I was careful to keep my pristine suit inches away from his ruin. I lowered my voice so only he could hear me. It was a whisper of pure ice. "I am a very good pharmacist, Lance. I know the molecular weight of every poison and every cure known to man. I know exactly which receptors to block to stop your cramping. I know exactly which enzyme to introduce to neutralize the acid in your gut." His eyes lit up with hope, but I continued, my voice hardening into steel. "I also know the interaction between betrayal and consequence, and unfortunately for you, there is no pill for what you did to me." His hope shattered. The light died in his eyes, replaced by a terrifying realization. "You," he whispered, "you did this." I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my trousers. "You threw out my clothes," I said, my voice projecting to the silent officers and the rolling cameras. "You threw out my dignity like it was trash. You tried to flush me out of your life to make room for your whore and your lies." I reached into my pocket. I pulled out my wedding ring. It was a heavy diamond, a symbol of the sterling wealth, a shackle I had worn for 5 years. I held it up. The stage lights caught the facets, making it sparkle brilliantly against the backdrop of squalor. You wanted me to be trash, I said. So I am returning your property to where it belongs. I dropped the ring. It fell in slow motion. It landed with a soft plop right into the puddle of bile and filth next to Lance's face. Lie in the bed you made, Lance, I said. Or rather, lie in the mess you made. I turned my back on him. Kira, he screamed. A primal sound of loss and fury. You bitch. You cannot leave me like this. I did not break stride. I walked past Serafina, who was being handcuffed by a female officer while still weeping about her dress. I walked past Victoria, who was staring at the floor in catatonic shock. I walked to the edge of the stage and descended the stairs. The police cleared a path for me. They looked at me with a mixture of fear and respect. They knew a force of nature when they saw one. I walked down the center aisle of the empty ballroom. The tables were overturned. The expensive centerpieces were smashed. The floor was littered with abandoned shoes and purses left behind by the fleeing guests. It looked like the aftermath of a war. And I was the general walking away from the victory. I pushed open the main double doors of the estate. Outside, the night was chaotic. The driveway was jammed with ambulances, police cars, and news vans. The paparazzi had arrived in swarms, sensing blood in the water. When I stepped out onto the portico, a wall of flashbulbs exploded. It was blinding. 100 cameras clicked at once, capturing the image of the woman in the black suit walking out of the house of horrors. Mrs. Sterling, a reporter shouted, thrusting a microphone at me. What happened inside? Is it true the family has been arrested? Are you sick too? I stopped. I looked at the camera. I did not speak. I simply smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was not a sad smile. It was the smile of the Sphinx. It was the smile of a woman who had balanced the equation. I walked past them. I did not answer a single question. I did not look back at the mansion that loomed against the night sky like a dark, infected tooth. I walked to my car, parked in the lower lot. It was the only ordinary car in a sea of luxury vehicles. I got in. I started the engine. I rolled down the window as I drove toward the gate. The sea air rushed in, cold and biting and impossibly fresh. It smelled of salt and freedom. It smelled of a future that belonged entirely to me. I drove past the ambulance where they were loading Lance onto a stretcher. He was strapped down, thrashing, screaming my name. I did not tap the brakes. I accelerated. I drove through the iron gates of Emerald Cliff, leaving the sirens, the screams, and the sterling legacy fading in my rearview mirror. The road ahead was dark, winding, and completely open. For the first time in 5 years, I could breathe. Thank you so much for listening to this story of ultimate retribution. I would love to know where you are tuning in from right now. So please drop a comment below with your location and let's share our thoughts on this toxic family's downfall. If you enjoyed watching the Sterling Empire crumble, please make sure to subscribe to Scarlet Revenge Stories. Hit that like button, and if you want to support the channel even more, smash that hype button so this story can reach and empower even more people.